Okay, this is question 3b. We're going to look at question 3b, which is this one here. I've chosen this one because out of the two, this is the uh, question that interests me the most. Okay, I'll make a video on this question and question 2a and b another time. But you either choose question 3a or 3b. It's worth 16 marks. It's the question that you're marked on spelling, punctuation and grammar, so you've really got to proofread your work here, spell your technical and keywords right, and make sure your grammar's correct, full stop, capital letters, punctuation, etc., commas. You've really got to think about how you structure your paragraphs. You're looking at a good 2-page answer or more here, with a strong conclusion and a really good start to the essay, because it is a mini essay this. So, were attacks on Jewish businesses the worst effects of Nazi persecution of the Jews in the year 1933 to 39? Explain your answer. So really, you're looking to develop an explanation of consequence, okay? What had the worst consequence or effect of this Nazi state-sponsored persecution on the Jews, okay? And it gives you little guidelines here. Look, attacks on Jewish businesses. Really, they're looking at 1933, okay, and the early attacks on Jewish businesses against the later attacks of 1939, of the horrific events of November the 9th of Crystal Night, the night of broken glass. So you're weighing up what was worse, and you bring other factors in as well to try and prioritise your judgment. What was worst? What had the worst consequences in terms of Nazi persecution? So, let's begin and think about how we'd lay this out. I think that I would start by talking about the attacks in 1933, April 1933, on the Jewish businesses and the impact they had. Remember, the brown shirts, the SA, were very violent towards the Jews, and they would be intimidating, graffitiing outside their shops, putting a Jewish sign on the shops, the Star of David, making sure that Germans shopped in shops that were owned by Germans, telling people not to go in there, attacking Jewish people on the streets, standing outside and intimidating shoppers. This was really a real horrible experience for the Jews, but it wasn't as intimidating as what happened in 1938, okay, Kristallnacht. If I said 1939 earlier, sorry, I meant 1938. Okay, the 8th and 9th of November. 8th, 9th and 10th of November. Also, we know that the Jews in April 1933 were banned from government jobs, had their dignity and their rights stripped away. Okay, they were banned from inheriting land, and by May 1935 they could no longer serve in the army, or June 1935 they could no longer eat in restaurants. This was real segregation happening against the Jewish race. But it wasn't violent to the extent that we witnessed it during Kristallnacht, okay? But it was still very unpleasant and part of this state-sponsored persecution by the Nazis, organised persecution against the Jewish race in Germany. So then if we look at Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass, and we develop our explanation, I believe that you would be saying that Kristallnacht was a terrible experience. You could say something along these lines. On Kristallnacht, the Nazis encouraged the SS and the German people to attack Jewish shops and businesses. Many windows were smashed, synagogues were burned to the ground, and a number of Jews were murdered. Not only was there considerable damage and loss of life, but the Nazis blamed the Jews for the damage caused and forced them to pay a huge fine. This was worse than the earlier attacks on the Jewish businesses, because it encouraged much greater persecution in the months that followed, as well as moving some Jews into the ghettos. You could add this was the start of the Holocaust that was to really escalate during the war years, but I wouldn't go any further than that because it says up to 1939. But you've made a judgment, and you're saying that the persecution during Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass, was the start of a real violent campaign of death and murder towards the Jewish race, as opposed to the early days of 1933, when it was boycotts and and one-off here and there attacks on the Jews. So you're making a judgment and you're communicating and writing this. You could say something along the lines of, however, it was the gradual culmination of a number of factors which gradually affected the Jews in Germany and undermined their position, beginning with the boycott of Jewish shops in 1933, to the loss of citizenship and other rights with the Nuremberg Laws of 1939, the discrimination and victimization in schools, through to the systematic attacks on Jewish businesses and synagogues on Kristallnacht. So you're showing that you understand the timeline of progression. You could go into further detail about the Nuremberg Laws, and you could argue they were worse than the Jewish attacks on businesses on Kristallnacht, because these were systematic laws put into place by the Nazis from the 15th of September 1935 in Nuremberg. And these laws stripped away German citizenship, so the Reich law on citizenship stated that only those of German blood could be German citizens. Jews lost the right to vote, hold government office or have German passports. Or the Reich law for the protection of German blood and honour forbade Jews from marrying German citizens. I mean, this is awful, isn't it? If you're in love with a Jewish person or in a relationship, it was now made illegal. From 1938 onwards, Jews had to register all their possessions, making it easier for the government to confiscate them in the future. And by July 1938, they have to carry an identity card with the big letter J for Jews stamped on it. They had to have this on them at all times. Random sporadic attacks on Jews were developing by the German soldiers on the streets. From July 1938, Jewish doctors, dentists and lawyers were forbidden to work for white Aryan Germans. So they were proper segregating Jewish professionals from mixing with full-blooded Aryan Germans, the master race in the eyes of the Nazis. So if you look at the Nuremberg Laws, were they more important for establishing the dehumanisation and the persecution of the Jewish race? Or is Kristallnacht the absolute worst effect of Nazi persecution, because many Jews were murdered, and it was really the symbolic of how the Jewish lives were going to change for the worse, and this stepped up campaign of violence. What we probably can agree on is it was far worse than the early days of 1933 with the Jewish attacks and boycotting of Jewish businesses and shops. But you've got to argue that, and you've got to set out your argument clearly with a really coherent conclusion. And the skill is to make sure that in your paragraphs you link things together, and you make sure that you can show through explanation and analysis why you feel one factor is more important than another factor, and then sum this up in a conclusion. And if you can do that and write about 6 to 7 well developed paragraphs, you will be aiming for a high level 3, level 4 out of 16. Remember, spelling, punctuation and grammar counts on this question, so make sure you really have learned your key words and you proofread your work at the end.